Alright, so we're up now with video number 4, which is going to cover the class Reptilia. So again, kind of recapping what we've seen before, we started off with the Myxini, which were the hagfish. We had the Cephalophytomorphi, which were the lamprey. We had the, we had the Chondrichthyes, which were the sharks and skates and rays. The Actinopterygii, which were the bony fish. And Sarcopterygii, which are the lobe-fin fish. Moving into the next group, we had the class Amphibia, and we covered 3 orders there, the Anura, Chordata, and Apoda. And now we're moving into the class Reptilia, where, as promised in the previous section, I'm going to ruin this question for you forever. So the next time you hear somebody ask, which came first, the chicken or the egg, of course it's supposed to be a question which really doesn't have an answer. In reality, with a little bit of biological knowledge, we know actually the egg came first. And the reason we know that is that reptiles started making what amounts to a bird egg way, way, way before there were ever birds, including chickens. So the reptilian egg, and of course we know that birds are reptiles, the reptilian egg came way before there were ever birds because birds evolved much, much later after several other groups of reptiles had been laying the same type of egg for millions and millions of years. So the class Reptilia is kind of our medium group, right? So the fishes are the biggest, the birds are the second biggest, reptiles are third, amphibians fourth, and mammals are the smallest group in terms of diversity. So the main things that we see in modern day extant reptiles, and extant again means not extinct, means they're still around today, are amniotic eggs, which is really the key development that reptiles established that made them become a fairly successful group and last for a really, really long time. These eggs are able to be laid on land without any sort of water around, and they are self-contained, right? So they have a shell, but they also have 4 amniotic membranes, or 4 membranes in general, which helps provide all the life support systems that that embryo will ever need until it hatches. So very, very key development. We also have dry skin, right? Reptiles do really well in dry environments. They have dry skin, they have scaly skin, which helps prevent water loss, but the kind of the trade-off there is, as we talked about with the amphibians use their skin as a respiratory surface because it was kept moist all the time. Reptiles, on the other hand, because they have dry skin, what does that mean? It means they can't breathe through their skin. And so the consequence of that is that reptiles have to have a more efficient means of breathing using just their lungs since they cannot use their skin. So reptiles developed a diaphragm. They developed what's called thoracic breathing, in which they're able to create negative pressure in their lungs, which pulls air in from the outside world in a much more efficient manner than amphibians could ever possibly do. Most of the reptiles also have a 3-chambered heart, not unlike what we saw in the amphibians, but the one exception there would be the crocodilia, because the crocodilians actually do have a 4-chambered heart, which is very, very similar to both the avian heart, the bird heart, and the mammalian heart. And then finally, again, this is kind of a theme we've seen throughout the course, for animals that reproduce on dry land, reptiles, they're going to have internal fertilization because external just does not work on dry land. So let's take a look at that amniotic egg, right? We talked about the shell, which is protective. That's kind of the least interesting structure. It's protective, but the shell is also somewhat breathable, so gases can get in. And at the very least, the embryo has some gas exchange going on with the outside world. Underneath that shell, there's the first layer called the chorion. The chorion is the gas exchange layer, and you might expect the gas exchange layer would be the one on the outside because it's the one that has to be able to interact with the environment through that shell, and you'd be right. The chorion is the gas exchange, the breathing membrane of the supportive parts of the egg that helps keep the embryo alive. The amnion is just within the chorion. The amnion is a watery layer. It's a fluid-filled layer, which helps to give the embryo some cushioning and some support and some protection, right? So the shell does quite a bit of the protection, but the amnion does the rest. It's like the embryo is surrounded by a waterbed almost to give it protection against shock, against physical trauma. Within the amnion, there's then a yolk sac, which provides food, calories, nutrients for the embryo, because once the embryo has a shell placed around it, no more food can get in. The female has to provide all the nutrients that that embryo will ever need until it hatches within that yolk sac. And then finally, there's also the allantois, which is the waste disposal part of the amniotic egg. This is a chamber in which metabolic waste from the embryo can go so that it doesn't become poisoned by its own waste. Essentially, it's like a hazardous waste site within the egg, which helps to give the embryo somewhere to send its metabolic waste, because again, those things can't get out of the egg because it's surrounded by a shell. The allantois is a kind of a safe place to put those wastes. And so we see those same four membranes, not just in reptiles, but also birds. And you got to ask yourself, well, who's the other descendant of the reptiles? And that would be the mammals, including humans, right? So obviously humans don't lay a shelled egg, at least most of us. But we do still have the same four membranes that reptiles have. They're different. They're different as far as their relative sizes, the relative importance, the relative functionality, because they're not surrounded by a shell. But the same four layers are there in some way. All right, so reptiles were the dominant group on Earth for around 250 million years until the Cretaceous extinction that we talked about a couple of lectures ago. Because it was such a big group, especially previously, it's still a reasonably sized group now, but it was much bigger previously. The way these reptiles are classified is based on essentially the number of holes behind their eye socket, which gives you a way to kind of group these into different categories. So anapsids are reptiles that don't have any openings behind the orbit or eye socket. Synapsids are those that give rise to a single opening behind the orbit, and diapsids are those that give rise to two openings behind the orbit. So it's a little bit of a broad scale classification of the reptiles there. We are not going to talk about this slide, so we can skip that. We're also going to skip most of this except for this last little bit here, right? So dinosaurs are a single group of reptiles. And so it turns out that not any old, big, extinct animal can be classified as a dinosaur. Dinosaurs are a very, very specific group within the reptiles. Just like you might say that, okay, well, not every mammal is a primate, not every reptile was a dinosaur. Kind of the same idea, right? There's a very specific lineage of reptiles that were dinosaurs, were truly dinosaurs, that for the most part went extinct about 65 million years ago. Now, there were reptiles around that didn't go extinct 65 million years ago, most notably probably the crocodilians, right? They've been around longer than 65 million years. They survived the Cretaceous extinction, but most of the reptiles that were around, the really big ones especially, died out when this asteroid hit the Earth 65 million years ago, give or take. Now, a little bit about that. This asteroid was not trivial, right? This thing, they think, was roughly the size of Texas, based on the size of the crater that it left behind. And they think that it was traveling at about 25,000 miles an hour. So picture a giant rock the size of Texas traveling at 25,000 miles an hour, all of a sudden slamming into the Earth. Now that's going to cause some effects. That's going to leave a mark, so to speak. And so it did actually leave a mark. There's a crater just off the Yucatan Peninsula underwater that dates back to the Cretaceous period and has traces of extraterrestrial minerals in it. Things like iridium and so forth are in it. And so that's a really good evidence that this might have been the remnants of that asteroid that hit the Earth. Now, as far as what effect that had for animals, lots and lots of dust kicked up into the air, blocking out sunlight for millions of years, which caused a big drop in productivity of plants. And of course, when plant productivity drops, herbivore productivity drops. And when herbivore productivity drops, carnivore productivity drops. And so the ones that were hit hardest were the biggest of those animals, which happened to be the dinosaurs, right? They simply didn't have enough food to sustain those very, very large bodies. And really, for some of them, there's really good evidence to suggest that some of the biggest of the dinosaurs were actually endothermic in that they could maintain their own body heat with metabolic activity, which is what we do, right? As mammals, and also birds do the same thing. We use heat from our metabolism to regulate our body temperature. Most reptiles, amphibians, and fish are going to use the environment to regulate their body temperature. So if they need to warm up, they go lay in the sun. If they need to cool off, they go lay in the shade. A lot of the really big reptiles, it turns out, probably were endothermic because they were so big, right? They were so big, they had so many cells that the collective heat produced by those cells was enough to regulate their body temperature. All right, so we talked about these characteristics before when the intro to reptiles section or slide a few slides ago. Internal fertilization, there has to be fertilization before the shell is put in place, otherwise there'd be no way for the sperm to get to the egg. We talked about better circulation, we talked about better breathing, more efficient breathing, so that's going to help to establish a greater metabolism, a larger body size, just generally the things we associate with reptiles versus their ancestors, which were the amphibians. We talked about the heart, the septum again between that one ventricle. We start off with a three-chambered heart with the ventricle only partially divided, and by the time we get to the crocodilians and eventually birds and mammals, there is a complete septum between the two sides of the ventricle. It actually creates two separate ventricles, and then therefore you can say we have a four-chambered heart. Again, our pulmonary circulation and systemic circulation for reptiles, double loop circulatory system, right? So between the heart and lungs versus between the heart and the rest of the body, we have one loop systemic, we have one loop pulmonary for two loops in total. Fishes, on the other hand, just have that single loop, right? So ventricle to gills to body back to heart. Single loop circulatory system. Not very efficient, but it works if you're a fish. Reptilian, double loop circulation, much more efficient, circulating much more oxygenated blood throughout the body. Just kind of a quick point on this as well. Whenever you see a circulatory diagram like this, and we're gonna see these later on as well in the course, anything color-coded red is arterial blood. Typically, it's oxygen rich. Anytime we see blue, this is oxygen poor. Usually, that's venous blood. And if we see purple, which we're not going to see in the human circulatory system, but if you see purple, it means there's a mixture of red and blue. So it's a little more oxygenated than the blue stuff, but not as oxygenated as the red stuff. Right? So that's our circulatory systems here. We talked about ectothermy. This is the idea that the environment is used in these animals to help regulate their body temperature. They can use both conduction and convection to warm their bodies. So conduction is where heat is transferred between two solid surfaces. So between, say, a warm rock in the body of a snake, that would be conduction, where the snake is obtaining heat to warm its body to regulate metabolism, and vice versa. If it's convection, convection is a heat transfer between air and a solid surface. So if you just have, an animal laying out in the sun, warm air warms the body, and that's used to regulate their body temperature accordingly. So reptiles can use both ways to regulate their body temperature, but what most reptiles can't do is use metabolic heat. It's not that the reptiles don't produce body heat, it's that they have a slower metabolism than a bird or a mammal, therefore they put off less waste heat, therefore they're less able to regulate their body temperature. Right? So it's not that they're not producing any body heat, it's just that they're not producing enough to actually regulate their temperature. Now, there are some modern day reptiles which are probably at least somewhat endothermic. The biggest of the sea turtles, the leatherback sea turtle, things like the Komodo dragon, really big lizard, likely have enough cells in their body that even though each cell isn't putting out that much heat, they simply have so many cells that kind of by default turns them into endotherms, like a bird or a mammal would be. The four orders of reptiles are the Colonia, or the Testudinea is another name for this, we saw on the slide a few slides ago, which are the turtles and tortoises. We have the Rhynchocephalia, which are the tuataras, only a couple of species of those in the entire world. We have the Squamata, which is the biggest group of reptiles. These are lizards and snakes. And then we have the Crocodilia, which are crocodiles, alligators, and caimans. So reptiles do really well in most parts of the world, except in places that get really cold, because again, they don't really have such a great capacity to regulate their body heat. If you start getting into really extreme latitudes, like north and south of the equator, or if you start getting into more extreme altitudes, like going up the side of a mountain, there is a point at which you just stop seeing reptiles because it's too cold for them to be able to function effectively. Alright, so we'll take a look at the turtles and tortoises next. And if we remember all the way back when I talked about the cnidarians, remember I made the statement that cnidarians are not a very big group of animals, but most people generally know what a jellyfish looks like, even though they may have never seen one in real life. Chelonians are kind of the same way, right? So turtles and tortoises, only 250 species in the entire world, but everybody knows what a turtle or a tortoise looks like, right? They're unique. There's nothing else like them, nothing else with a shell attached to the body that is anything like what a turtle and tortoise does. That shell, by the way, is part of their skeleton. It is attached to their skeleton. It's bone, so it's counter to the kind of idea or image of a turtle being able to somehow get out of its shell. The shell is very much a part of their body. And so the shell on the dorsal side of the animal is called the carapace. The shell on the ventral side, on the belly side, is the plastron. And so there's a lot of study you can actually do of the shell of these animals to determine how they function in the world around them. Tortoises tend to be more terrestrial. Turtles tend to be aquatic, but there are exceptions, right? So things like wood turtles and box turtles, those are terrestrial turtles. But for the most part, turtles tend to be more aquatic, even to the point where they are almost entirely aquatic, like the sea turtles are. Uh, by looking at the feet of one of these animals, you can learn a lot about how it makes its living. So if you look at the picture on the right, this guy over here has really thick, tough claws and wide feet to help burrow or dig its way into the ground, versus this one over here. It's kind of hard to see in the picture, but this actually has webbed feet, which helps it to swim very quickly. And if you go, again, one step even more extreme to the sea turtles, they have flippers, which are very, very different feet because they are living in the water almost exclusively, and they only come out onto land to reproduce, to lay their eggs. And when they do come onto land, they're really pretty awkward about it because they're walking around on those flippers that do pretty well in the water, but not so well on land. Turtles and tortoises never have teeth, but they do have a beak, and those beaks can produce a whole lot of pounds of pressure per square inch. They can bite off anything they need to bite off very, very easily. Their beaks almost work like scissors to cut off pieces of food or in some cases even prey that they're going to feed on. Some of them have some very powerful bites, especially, again, the sea turtles that have such big mouths and large beaks. They can actually do quite a bit of damage if they're so inclined. These animals are tied to land, so even the sea turtles, which spend most of the time in the water, like I said before, have to come onto land to reproduce, and then they go back into the water. So that's actually a bit of a detriment to their survival. And normally I like to go into a little bit of discussion of sea turtles and conservation issues and threats and those kinds of things, but we simply don't have the time right now to do that. But the fact that they come onto land to lay their eggs is a bit of a detriment to their survival because it's a very difficult way for especially the offspring to make a living. That being said, now the sea turtles typically, historically, have been protected, so to speak, by people trying to conserve nests and people trying to help those baby sea turtles get back into the water once they've hatched out of their eggs. It turns out, even though those efforts they're not misguided, right? The people have the right spirit. They're trying to protect the turtles. They're trying to do what they can to help these endangered species. And there are 7 species of sea turtles. They're all endangered, some of them critically. People are trying to help them by helping those cute little tiny sea turtle babies get into the water. But it turns out that by the time they get into the water, a lot of those baby sea turtles are going to die anyway because of predation. And of course, once they're in the water, there's nothing you can do to protect them. The shift now has been to conservation efforts on the adult and largest of the turtles in the population because they're the ones that do the most reproduction. Protecting the babies is great, but you can only do so much. And when they get into the water, they have a very, very high mortality rate anyway. But for those that survive to adulthood, they can live for decades and decades and decades. If you protect them, then they'll keep making offspring year after year after year, and that will actually eventually help, theoretically at least, bring the sea turtle populations back to a more stable state. Turtles also do something that crocodilians do, and that's called temperature-dependent sex determination. So if we think about things like mammals, ourselves included, if we think about things like birds, they use chromosomes to determine the sex of the offspring. Turtles and crocodilians both don't have sex chromosomes, but instead they use the temperature of the environment to determine which individuals in a nest are going to be male and which individuals are going to be female. So in turtles, males are produced in warmer nests. Sorry, I got it backwards. In turtles, males are produced in cooler nests. Females are produced in warmer nests. In crocodilians, it's opposite. So in crocodilians, males are produced in warm nests. Females are produced in cooler nests. So in terms of the turtles, that going back to sea turtles for a second, that's actually been a big problem in a lot of parts of the world, including places like Florida, where there are a lot of situations where they will actually import sand from the Caribbean to make beaches in Florida look more aesthetically pleasing, make them prettier, right? So a natural beach in Florida would not have brilliant, white, pretty, reflective sand. It would be kind of dark, dirty looking sand that most people would find to be less attractive than the really white, pretty stuff. The problem with that is that white sand is also more reflective. So sea turtles coming onto beaches in Florida, when they lay their eggs are being laid into a more reflective surface, which means below ground temperature is going to be cooler, which means more individuals are going to be produced that are male than individuals that are female. And since these turtle populations are in rough shape, you really should be producing more females, because females will help bring the population up faster than males will. But because the sand has been altered around them, and because the turtles don't really know about this whole thing, there has been a shift toward a more male-biased population of turtles where these beaches have been modified by the importation of whiter, more reflective sand. Rhynchocephalia, very, very small. This is now an entire order that only has two species. These things are native to New Zealand. They are about a half a meter long, and they look a lot like a lizard, right? They look like a cross between a water dragon and an iguana or a bearded dragon kind of a thing. But they are unique, right? This is another one of those living fossil species. One of the unique things about it is that it has a third eye on top of its head. And so this is not like, a lot of reptiles will have a photoreceptive spot on the top of their head, which is not really an eye. But it's kind of like the ocelli we talked about in insects, which they can use to monitor time of day based on light intensity. The rhynchocephalians actually have an actual eye on top of their head. They literally have three eyes. So the eye on top of their head is covered up with a scale, but it does have a lens and it does have a retina, just like a regular eye would. If it didn't have the scales covering it, it actually would be able to process and form images, which is kind of cool. They can actually see above them using this parietal eye, but probably not in great detail because, like I said before, it is covered up with at least one scale on top of the head. The squamates are lizards and snakes. The one feature that is unique among the squamata is the fact that males have paired copulatory organs. Basically, they have two penises. And there's a lot of diversity in the structure and shape and morphology of those copulatory organs, especially in the snakes. There's some really weird kind of, I guess, S&M sorts of structures in those organisms where they have various types of hooks and spines on the penis to help them copulate with a female. They look fairly unpleasant, but that is something which is used for classification in those squamates at least. Snakes, there are about 3,000 species. Unique features among them is that they do not have external legs, although some of them do have remnants of legs in their skeleton or on their skeletons. They'll have hip bones, for example. The boas are kind of famous for having legs present on their skeleton, even though they're not actually outside the body. Some of the hip bones are still present in the skeleton, which is an evolutionary holdover from the ancestors, which did have legs. They don't have eyelids, so you'll never, ever, ever see a snake wink at you or blink. And they do not have external ears. So snakes aren't really deaf, so to speak, but they also don't hear very well because they don't have external ears. They can feel vibrations in the ground very, very well, but they can't hear hardly at all. So that's a feature which is unique among them. Lizards are a little bit more diverse, and there really isn't a single feature that unites all lizards into a single group. A lot of them can regenerate tails, many of them cannot. There are some lizards that look a lot like snakes. They actually are legless lizards called, legless lizards or glass lizards is another name for them, which might lead you to ask the question, well, how do you tell the difference between a legless lizard and a snake? And there's a couple of ways, actually. So a legless lizard does have eyelids. It does have external ears. It has ear openings. So if you see something like that looks like a snake, but it has eyelids and has holes behind its eyes for ears, then you know it's actually a lizard that happens to look like a snake. The last order here would be the crocodilia. These are the biggest, the most carnivorous of all the modern day reptiles. Crocodilians versus alligators. Crocodilians are typically nocturnal in most cases, all of them. They live in tropical and subtropical regions. They don't really like places that get too cold. So in terms of, closest to us, we're looking at the Gulf states basically. So, Alabama, Mississippi, parts of Florida, Louisiana, maybe a little bit of Texas as well. Those places are the places that have the greatest abundance of crocodilians in our part of the world. The American alligator is found there. And actually one of the few success stories, real big success stories in conservation is the American alligator because they were threatened for a number of years, but they've actually recovered to the point now where they have hunting seasons for alligators because they're so abundant, which is a good thing, right? It's a unique animal that serves a very important role in the ecosystem. There's only two species of alligators in the entire world. There's the American alligator and the Chinese alligator. Everything else in this group is technically a crocodile, although there are also caimans, which are smaller versions of crocodiles that are somewhat similar. As far as telling the difference between the two, usually, if I show this picture, I say, all right, is this a crocodile or an alligator? 9 times out of 10, when I show this picture in class, people will say, okay, well, this is, it's an alligator. because it's got a wide snout. Well, wide and narrow are kind of subjective terms, and what might seem narrow to one person might seem broad to somebody else. So it's not a real good black and white criteria for distinguishing these two groups from each other. The surefire way to tell an alligator versus a crocodile is by looking at this tooth right here. So if you see an animal that looks like an alligator, but has the fourth bottom tooth sticking up alongside the snout here, then we know it's a crocodile. Alligators actually have a socket in their upper jaw that this tooth fits into. So when they have their mouths closed, you don't see this big tooth sticking up if it's an alligator. Crocodiles don't have that socket, so when they close their mouth, the tooth is forced up alongside the snout, and that gives them that kind of snaggletooth appearance that we see here. This one actually is a crocodile in that picture. It's a big one, but it is a crocodile. These are the pinnacle of ambush hunters. They lie just underneath the water surface. A lot of times when you see them, they look like just a floating log, basically. They have the nostrils on top of the snout. They have the eyes on top of the head as well, so they can lie just under the water surface really all day and watch what's going on around them. They can breathe, and when something gets too close to them, they can all of a sudden explosively come to life and attack them and eventually consume them. So very, very good predators, very, very good at what they do, and they've been around for a long time, and this strategy works quite well for them, the way that they hunt. They also have that temperature-dependent sex determination, like I talked about with the turtles. In this case, males are produced in warm nests, females are produced in cool nests, and females actually seem to be able to regulate the relative sex ratio of the offspring by creating nests that are either deeper or more shallow, or by layering more vegetation over it. So when a crocodilian goes to make a nest, what she'll do is she'll dig out a hole in the ground, and then she'll lay the eggs in it. It's like a turtle does. But then the female crocodilian will take vegetation from around the area and layer it over the nest. And what that does is that when that vegetation rots, it produces heat, which then incubates the eggs, which is kind of a cool thing to do, right? So the bacteria that are decomposing that vegetation, just like every other living thing, when they're metabolically active, they produce heat, which then incubates the eggs. Eventually, when the eggs hatch, the babies inside the nest will make a sort of a peeping, crying sound. The female will hear that because she doesn't ever go very far from the nest, and she'll come and uncover those babies and carry them one by one into the water, where she'll then take care of them for at least a week or two, if not a little bit longer. Well, she'll kind of watch out for her babies. A lot of diversity here in terms of, habitats and how they function and what they look like. These are both crocodiles in this picture. It's kind of hard to tell with the mouth open, but this is more of a, I think it's a saltwater crocodile in this case. This one is a fish-eating crocodile with that long snout, very narrow, and lots of teeth they use to kind of thrash around in the water, injure fish, and then consume them after the fact. This group actually is somewhat bird-like. They're kind of a distant cousin to the birds. They do have that really good parental care I talked about. They do have a four-chambered heart. So for those reasons, we think this is one of the sister groups to the birds, which will be the next one we talk about in our next video. So with that, I'm going to wrap up this section, and we'll pick up the next section and talk about the birds.